A cycle you don't want to ride. Take a look at what typically happens to someone who is unable to overcome the fear of failure and gets caught in the fear cycle. Prior negative experiences cause the person to develop a fear of failure. That starts the cycle. For example, let's say someone experienced failure as a child trying to sell candy door to door to raise money for school. Later, as an adult, he is put in a situation that seems similar, and fear strikes. Whether he is a salesperson with a need to make calls on customers or a pastor with a mission to visit people in their homes, that old childhood failure may generate fear. The fear of rejection creates inaction. Because the person doesn't act, he doesn't gain personal experience in that situation, which is the key to learning and overcoming future obstacles. The lack of experience breeds an inability to handle similar situations, and that ultimately feeds and increases the fear. The longer the fear remains unchecked, the harder a person has to work to break the cycle. Fear of failure stops forward progress. The inaction that results when people are stuck in the fear cycle takes on many forms. Here are the three most common ones I've observed. 1. Paralysis. For some people, fear of failure brings about absolute paralysis. They stop trying to do anything that might lead to failure. President Harry S. Truman offered this opinion. The worst danger we face is the danger of being paralyzed by doubts and fears. This danger is brought on by those who abandon faith and sneer at hope. It is brought on by those who spread cynicism and distrust and try to blind us to the great chance to do good for all mankind. People whose fear paralyzes them give up any hope of moving forward. 2. Procrastination. Other people maintain the hope of progress, but never get around to following through. Someone once called procrastination the fertilizer that makes difficulties grow. Victor Kiam stated it even more strongly. He called it opportunity's natural assassin. Procrastination steals a person's time, productivity, and potential. As President John F. Kennedy said, there are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction. Figure 1. The fear cycle. At the center of the circle, you have the fear cycle. Fear leads to inaction. Inaction leads to inexperience. Inexperience leads to inability. Inability leads to fear. And so the cycle continues. Procrastination is too high a price to pay for the fear of failure. 3. Purposelessness. Tom Peters, co-author of In Search of Excellence, emphasizes that there's nothing more useless than someone who comes to the end of the day and congratulates himself, saying, "Well, I made it through the day without another fuck-up." That's why many people who fail do. Rather than pursuing worthy objectives, they avoid the pain of making mistakes. And in the midst of that transition, they lose sight of any sense of purpose that they might once have possessed. As fear of failure and the resulting inactivity compound, A person in the fear cycle exhibits additional negative effects. Self-pity. He feels sorry for himself, and as the time goes on, he takes less responsibility for his inactivity and starts thinking of himself as a victim. Excuses. A person can fall down many times, but he won't be a failure until he says that somebody pushed him. In fact, the person who makes a mistake, then offers an excuse for it, adds a second mistake to his first. A person can break out of the fear cycle only by taking personal responsibility for his inaction. Misused energy. Constant fear divides the mind and causes a person to lose focus. If he is going in too many directions at once, he doesn't get anywhere. It's comparable to stomping the gas pedal of a car that's in neutral. Hopelessness. If allowed to run their course, continual fear and inaction rob a person of hope. And poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow described the situation in this way. The setting of a great hope is like the setting of the sun. The brightness of our life is gone. Breaking the cycle. People who want to get out of the fear cycle often spend time feeling guilty for their inability to change. But one of the reasons they are stuck in the fear cycle is that they focus their energy on the wrong part of the cycle. Since they know that fear got the cycle going, they believe that they have to eliminate it to break the cycle. Yet, too many people are unable to do that. You can't avoid fear. No magic potion will take it away. And you can't wait for motivation to get you going. To conquer fear, you have to feel the fear and take action anyway. Several years ago, while I was sitting in my doctor's waiting room, I came across a few paragraphs in a medical magazine that described the battle to act. We hear it almost every day. Sigh, sigh, sigh. I just can't get myself motivated to lose weight, test my blood sugar, etc. And we hear an equal number of sighs from diabetes educators who can't get their patients motivated to do the right thing for the diabetes and the health. We've got news for you. Motivation is not going to strike you like lightning. And motivation is not something that someone else, nurse, doctor, family member, can bestow or force upon you. The whole idea of motivation is a trap. Forget motivation. Just do it. Exercise, lose weight, test your blood sugar, whatever. Just do it without the motivation, and guess what? After you start doing that thing, that's when the motivation comes and makes it easy for you to keep on doing it. Motivation is like love and happiness. It is a byproduct. When you're actively engaged in doing something, it sneaks up and zaps you when you least expect it. As Harvard psychologist Jerome Bruner says, you're more likely to act yourself into feeling than feel yourself into action. So act. Whatever it is you know, you should do it. Just do it. Get moving, build momentum, make mistakes, and move on. Playwright George Bernard Shaw asserted, a life spent in making mistakes is not only more honorable, but more useful than a life spent doing nothing. To overcome fear and break the cycle, you have to be willing to recognize that you will spend much of your life making mistakes. The bad news is that if you've been inactive for a long time, getting started is hard to do. The good news is that after you start moving, it gets easier. That is why if you can take action and keep making mistakes, you'll gain experience. President Theodore Roosevelt said, "He who makes no mistakes makes no progress." That experience eventually brings competence, and you make fewer mistakes. As a result, your fear becomes less paralyzing. But the whole cycle-breaking process starts with action. You must act your way into feeling, not wait for positive emotions to carry you forward. You're more likely to act yourself into feeling than feel yourself into action. An African parable captures the idea very well. Every morning in Africa, a gazelle wakes up. It knows that it must run faster than the fastest lion, or it will be killed. Every morning a lion wakes up. It knows that it must outrun the slowest gazelle, or it will starve to death. It doesn't matter whether you are a lion or a gazelle. When the sun comes up, you had better be running. If you have always had a hard time failing forward, then you have to get yourself moving. It doesn't matter what has stopped you or for how long you've been inactive. The only way to break the cycle is to face your fear and take action, even though it may seem small or insignificant. Even the best get stuck sometimes. Many unsuccessful people get stuck in the fear cycle. But the same thing happens to high achievers. For example, when you look at the life of the composer George Frederick Handel, you see a successful person who found himself in a rut that he desperately needed to break out of. Handel was a musical prodigy. Though his father wanted him to study law, he gravitated to music at an early age. By age 17, he held the post of church organist at the cathedral at Halle, his hometown. A year later, he became violinist and harpsichordist at the Kaiser's Opera House in Hamburg. By 21, he was a keyboard virtuoso. When he turned to composing, he gained immediate fame and was soon appointed Kapellmeister, conductor to the Elector of Hanover, later King George I of England. When he moved to England, his renown grew. By the time he was 40, he was world famous. A reversal of fortune. Despite Handel's talent and fame, he faced considerable adversity. Competition with rival English composers was fierce. Audiences were fickle and sometimes didn't turn out for his performances. And he was frequently the victim of the changing political winds of the times. Several times he found himself penniless and on the verge of bankruptcy. The pain of rejection and failure was difficult to bear, especially following his previous success. Then his problems were compounded by failing health. He suffered a seizure or stroke which left his right arm limp and caused him to lose the use of 4 fingers on his right hand. Although he recovered, he remained despondent. In 1741, Handel decided it was time to retire, even though he was only 56. He was discouraged, miserable, and consumed with debt. He felt certain he would land in debtor's prison. On April 8th, he gave what he considered his farewell concert. Disappointed and filled with self-pity, he gave up. The inspiration to move forward. But in August of that year, something incredible happened. A wealthy friend named Charles Jennings visited Handel and gave him a libretto based on the life of Christ. The work intrigued Handel enough to stir him to action. He began writing, and immediately the floodgates of inspiration opened in him. His cycle of inactivity was broken. For 21 days he wrote almost non-stop. Then he spent another 2 days creating the orchestrations. In 24 days he had completed the 260-page manual he called the piece Messiah. Today, Handel's Messiah is considered a masterpiece and the culmination of the composer's work. In fact, Sir Newman Flower, one of Handel's biographers, said of the writing of Messiah, considering the immensity of the work and the short time involved, it will remain, perhaps forever, the greatest feat in the whole history of music composition. When it comes to getting over the emotional hurts of failure, it really doesn't matter how good or bad your personal history is. The only thing that matters is that you face your fear and get moving. Do that, and you give yourself the opportunity to learn how to fail forward. Your fourth step to failing forward: take action and reduce your fear. What objective essential to your success are you most afraid of tackling right now? Write what it is here. The only way to get going is face that fear and act. Write down all of your fears associated with the activity. Examine your list and accept the fact that you're afraid. Determine what first step you can take to get started on achieving that objective. It doesn't matter whether it's small or large, just do it. If you fail at it, do it again. Keep trying until you accomplish that first step. Then figure out what the next step is. Remember, it's almost impossible to feel your way into acting. You must act your way into feeling. The only way to get over the fear is to take action. Steps to failing forward. 1. Realize there is one major difference between average people and achieving people. 2. Learn a new definition of failure. 3. Remove the you from failure. 4. Take action and reduce your fear. 5. Find the exit off the highway to failure. The moment of a question comes to your mind. See yourself mentally taking hold of it and disposing of it. In that moment, is your choice made? Thus, you learn to take the path to the right. Thus, you learn to become the decider and not the facilitator. Thus, you build character. H. Van Anderson. Business professors Gary Hamel and C.K. Perahad have written about an experiment that was conducted on a group of monkeys. It is a vivid story of failure. 4 monkeys were placed in a room that had a tall pole in the center. Suspended from the top of that pole was a bunch of bananas. One of the hungry monkeys started climbing the pole to get something to eat, but just as he reached out to grab a banana, he was doused with a torrent of cold water. Squealing, he scampered down the pole and abandoned his effort to feed himself. Each monkey made a similar attempt, and each one was drenched with cold water. After making several attempts, they finally gave up. Then, researchers removed one of the monkeys from the room and replaced him with a brand new monkey. As the newcomer began to climb the pole, the other 3 grabbed him and pulled him down to the ground. After trying to climb the pole several times and being dragged down by the others, he finally gave up and never attempted to climb the pole again. The researchers replaced the original monkeys one by one, and each time a new monkey was brought in, he would be dragged down by the others before he could reach the bananas. In time, the room was filled with monkeys who had never received a cold shower. None of them would climb the pole, but not one of them knew why. Don't let failure make a monkey out of you. Unfortunately, people who have gotten used to failure can be a lot like those monkeys. They make the same mistakes again and again, yet they are never quite sure why. And, as a result, they never seem to get off of what I call the failure freeway. The old saying is true. If you always do what you've always done, then you'll always get what you've always gotten. Let's face it, people are prone to ruts, and anyone who has been conditioned to think failure in his fate has especially hard time dealing with the failure freeway. If you feel like one of the monkeys in the experiment, meaning you can't seem to achieve what you desire but you don't know why, then take a look at the pattern many failure-prone people fall into and the ultimate solution. It all starts with a fuck-up. What starts people down the freeway to failure is a common mistake: failure or fuck-up. But people who stay on the failure freeway don't think that it's their fault. They are similar to the drivers who wrote the following explanations for the automobile accidents in which they were involved. As I reached an intersection, a hedge sprang up, obscuring my vision. An invisible car came out of nowhere, struck my car, and vanished. The telephone pole was approaching way too fast. I attempted to swerve out of its path when it struck my front end. The indirect cause of this accident was a little guy in a small car with a big mouth. I had been driving my car for 4 years when I fell asleep at the wheel and had an accident. I was on the way to the doctor's with the rear end trouble when my universal joint gave way, causing me to have an accident. To avoid hitting the bumper of the car in front, I struck the pedestrian. I was coming home, pulled into the wrong driveway, hit a tree I did not have. I was just keeping up with the cars behind me. The pedestrian had no idea which direction to run, so I ran him over. The guy was all over the road, and I had to swerve a number of times before hitting him. I pulled away at the side of the road, glanced at my mother-in-law, and headed over the embankment. Many people on the failure freeway make mistakes, but refuse to admit them. They see every obstacle or error as simply somebody else's fault, and as a result, they generally respond in one or more of the following ways. Blow up. One reaction to failure that keeps people on the freeway to failure is anger. You've probably seen it. People make a minor mistake and angrily overreact to it, taking out their frustration on themselves or other people around them. Unchecked anger makes a small problem larger. 19th century English author Charles Buxton summed it up in, "Bad temper is its own scourge. Few things are more bitter than to feel bitter. A man's venom poisons himself more than his victims. If a person doesn't govern his temper, it will govern him." Cover up. It's in the nature of people to try to cover up their mistakes. That tendency is as old as Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and it's usually just as successful for us today as it was for them. I heard a joke about a young Navy pilot on maneuvers that show how people often react to their mistakes. Prior to takeoff, the commanding admiral had ordered absolute radio silence from everyone engaged in the exercise. But one pilot mistakenly turned his radio on and heard to mutter, "Boy, am I fouled up." The admiral grabbed the mic from a radio operator and said, "Will the pilot who broke the radio silence identify himself immediately?" There was a long silence. Then a voice was heard over the radio. "I may be fouled up, but I'm not that fouled up." People's desire to make others don't see that their mistakes isn't always so humorous. For example, take the case of Nicholas Leeson. In 1995, the 28-year-old worked for the British bank Barings. He controlled huge amounts of money for the organization, which he tried to increase through what has been called casino-style investing. When Leeson's dealing resulted in huge losses, he covered them up and made even riskier trades to try to recoup the losses. Analysts say it was like betting double or nothing in a gambling game. The problem was that Leeson kept coming up with nothing, creating bigger and bigger losses. Ultimately, his action cost Barings $1.3 billion. He single-handedly put one of the oldest banks in the world out of business. H. Stanley Judd said, "Don't waste energy trying to cover up a failure. Learn from the failure and go on to the next challenge. It's okay to fail. If you're not failing, you're not growing. Anyone who wants to get off the highway to failure needs to fess up rather than cover up." Speed up. Particularly stubborn people sometimes try to leave their troubles behind by working harder and faster, but without changing their direction. They're like the person trying to get the square peg in the round hole who first tries to place the peg in the hole, then tries to shove it in, then takes a hammer and tries to pound it in. They're working hard, but they're getting nowhere. Don't waste energy trying to cover up failure. Learn from your failures and go on to the next challenge. It's okay to fail. If you're not failing, you're not growing. William Dean Singleton, co-owner of Media News Group, Inc., addresses this tendency. Too many people, when they make a mistake, just keep stubbornly plowing ahead and end up repeating the same mistakes. I believe in the motto, try and try again. But the way I read it, it says, try, then stop and think, then try again. Back up. Have you ever been talking with someone who made a thoughtless remark during a conversation, and as soon as he said it, you could tell he knew he had made a mistake? Yet, when you called him on it, he refused to admit it. No matter what you said, he kept backing up and trying to justify the remark, which made him look sillier and sillier. That's what people who back up do, and if they made a habit of it, they'll get stuck on the freeway to failure. When my wife Margaret and I were raising our children, Elizabeth and Joe Porter, both of whom are now married, we found that our son had a mind and will of his own. When he did something wrong, his first move was a lie. Then he'd back up and try to cover it up. I can still picture his offended expression as emphatically denied having eaten the chocolate candy, with his 9-year-old face smeared with chocolate. Margaret and I worked very hard to break him of that inclination. 90% of the people who fail are actually not defeated. They just quit. General Peyton C. March perceived, "Any man worth his salt will stick up for what he believes is right. But it takes a slightly bigger man to acknowledge instantly and without reservation that he is in error. I'm relieved that today my boy Joel is a man, and when he's wrong, he admits it. And that's good, because nobody can get off the highway to failure if they keep backing up." Give up. If you stay on the failure freeway long enough, you'll eventually slow up. It's similar to what happens on the interstate 285 loop around my hometown of Atlanta at rush hour. Gridlock. And that's when a lot of people simply give up. Personal growth, Paul J. Meyer says that 90% of the people who fail aren't actually defeated, they just give up. But in order to fail forward, you must wake up. There's only really one solution to the gridlock on the highway to failure, and that's to wake up and find the exit. To leave the road of continual failure, a person must utter the three most difficult words to say. I was wrong. He has to open his eyes, admit his mistake, and accept complete responsibility for his current wrong actions and bad attitudes. Every failure you experience is a fork in the road. It is an opportunity to take the right action, learn from your mistakes, and begin again. Leadership expert Peter Drucker says, the better a man is, the more mistakes he will make, for the more new things he will try. I would never promote to a top-level job a man who is not making mistakes. Otherwise, he is sure to be mediocre. Mistakes really do pave the road to achievement. Here is an acronym I created to help keep mistakes in perspective. Mistakes are messages that give us feedback about life. Interruptions that cause us to reflect and think. Signposts that direct us to the right path. Tests that push us towards greater maturity. Awakenings that keep the game mental. Keys that we can use to unlock the next doors to opportunity. Explorations that let us journey where we've never been before. Statements about our development and our progress. A few years ago, as I spoke at an event attended by more than 50,000 people, I shared something written by Portia Nelson. It has been one of the most requested pieces by people who have heard me speak. It's called Autobiography in 5 short chapters. Better than almost anything else, it describes the process of exiting the failure freeway. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place. But it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It is a habit. My eyes are open. I know where I am, and it is my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. The only way to exit the failure freeway and see the new territory of achievement is to take full responsibility for yourself and your mistakes. Michael Korda, editor-in-chief of the Simon & Schuster, declared, "Success on any major scale requires you to accept responsibilities. In the final analysis, the one quality that all successful people have is the ability to take on responsibility." successes on any major scale requires you to accept responsibilities. In the final analysis, the one quality that all successful people have is the ability to take on responsibility. Michael Korda.